Have you ever wondered if celebrating birthdays is something the Bible approves or condemns? Maybe you felt confused or even guilty about joining in these celebrations. You want to honor God, but you're not sure if birthdays fit with His teachings. In this video, we'll explore what the Bible really says about birthday celebrations, bringing clarity, peace, and guidance so you can celebrate with confidence and faith. But before we get into that, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so that way you can keep up with the latest updates. Now with that out of the way, it's time to uncover this question, so stay tuned until the end to know the answer. Birthdays are widely celebrated across the world. They are seen as special days where individuals recognize the passing of another year of life. Common traditions include parties, the gathering of family and friends, the giving of gifts, the sharing of meals, and often the singing of songs such as Happy Birthday. In many cultures, birthdays serve as an opportunity to reflect on life, express gratitude, and acknowledge personal growth or achievements. The act of celebrating birthdays itself is not unique to any one culture or religion. Different societies have developed various customs surrounding birthdays, including decorations, candles, making wishes, and other symbolic acts. Despite these variations, the central idea remains the same. It is a day focused on the individual who was born on that date. For Christians, however, the question arises whether celebrating birthdays aligns with biblical teachings. Since Christians seek to honor God in all aspects of life, they often ask, does the Bible approve or disapprove of birthday celebrations? This question is important because it involves evaluating common cultural practices in the light of Scripture. Christians do not want to adopt traditions that may go against God's will or principles. When examining the Bible, it becomes clear that it does not speak extensively about birthdays. The Bible does not contain explicit commandments either encouraging or forbidding the celebration of birthdays. This silence has led many believers to examine the few passages where birthdays are mentioned, analyze the context, and draw conclusions based on broader biblical principles. Since the Bible only refers to birthdays a limited number of times, each reference becomes significant in the discussion. These rare mentions are often carefully studied by Christians who are concerned about whether birthday celebrations are appropriate in God's eyes. The next step is to analyze these specific passages to see what they reveal. When studying the Bible for information about birthdays, it is immediately noticeable that birthdays are mentioned very rarely. Unlike other common topics such as worship, prayer, obedience, or sin, the subject of birthday celebrations appears only a few times in the entire biblical text. This scarcity makes every mention of birthdays in Scripture especially significant for anyone trying to understand the biblical perspective on this practice. The limited references to birthdays indicate that birthday celebrations were not a central part of the religious or cultural life of God's people, as described in the Bible. The Old Testament, which records many details about the lives of patriarchs, prophets, kings, and the nation of Israel, does not provide accounts of God's faithful servants celebrating their own birthdays. There is no record of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, or David marking their birthdays with any special ceremony or event. Similarly, the New Testament, which covers the ministry of Jesus, the apostles, and the early church, does not show any example of birthday celebrations among the early Christians. This absence of positive examples leads some believers to question whether birthday celebrations are aligned with biblical values. They argue that if celebrating birthdays was important or beneficial in God's eyes, we might expect to find clear examples or teachings supporting the practice among God's people. However, it is also important to recognize that the Bible does not present any direct commandment or teaching that prohibits birthday celebrations. The silence on this matter means that while there are no positive models, there is also no direct condemnation of the practice. This leaves the question open for further exploration, requiring believers to look at the few specific passages where birthdays are mentioned to gain more insight. The few instances where birthdays appear in the biblical text occur in very particular contexts. These include the birthdays of Pharaoh in the book of Genesis and Herod in the Gospel of Matthew. Since these occasions are not connected to God's faithful people but rather to rulers who did not follow God's ways, some Christians see these examples as potentially negative portrayals. To understand this better, it is necessary to examine these specific cases closely. One of the few explicit mentions of a birthday celebration in the Bible is found in the Old Testament, in the story of Joseph while he was in prison in Egypt. In Genesis 40 verses 20-22, the Bible records, "Now it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker. In this passage, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, celebrated his birthday with a feast for his officials. During this celebration he made significant decisions concerning two of his servants who had been imprisoned. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position but executed the chief baker. This event took place exactly as Joseph had interpreted their dreams earlier in the chapter. Some Christians observe that this particular birthday celebration was marked by a mixture of reward and punishment, with one man's life being restored and another man's life being taken. Because death occurred during this birthday celebration, some view this example as showing a negative association with birthdays. They argue that since the event involved judgment and execution, it casts a dark shadow over the practice of birthday celebrations. However, it is important to note that the Bible does not give any moral evaluation of Pharaoh's celebration itself. The text simply reports what happened without commenting on whether the celebration was good or evil. The judgment and execution of the baker were related to Pharaoh's decisions as a ruler and the fulfillment of Joseph's interpretation of their dreams, rather than the act of celebrating a birthday itself. Another consideration is that Pharaoh was a pagan ruler who did not serve the God of Israel. Therefore, his customs and practices may not reflect what is acceptable to God. Some believers conclude that because this birthday occurred in a pagan context, it should not serve as a model for Christians. Others suggest that since no direct commandment is given regarding Pharaoh's action, the passage does not provide enough evidence to form a clear biblical rule about birthday celebrations. This passage remains one of the key examples studied in this discussion, but it must be considered alongside other scriptures to build a more complete understanding. The second explicit mention of a birthday celebration in the Bible is found in the New Testament, during the rule of Herod Antipas. This account is described in Matthew 14 verses 6 to 10. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless for the oath's sake and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison. In this passage, Herod celebrated his birthday with a feast attended by many guests. During the celebration, Herodias' daughter performed a dance that pleased Herod. As a result, he made a foolish and rash oath, promising to give her whatever she requested. After consulting with her mother, she asked for the head of John the Baptist. Although Herod regretted the request, he felt obligated to keep his public promise and ordered John's execution. This event connects a birthday celebration directly to a tragic act of murder. For many Christians, this association raises serious concerns. The celebration led to prideful boasting, a careless promise, and ultimately the unjust death of one of God's greatest prophets. Some interpret this as another example where a birthday feast is surrounded by sinful behavior and deadly consequences. However, as with Pharaoh's birthday, it is important to observe that the Bible does not explicitly state that the celebration of Herod's birthday was wrong simply because it was a birthday. The sinful acts were Herod's irresponsible oath, his fear of losing face in front of his guests, and his failure to stand against evil. The murder of John the Baptist was a result of Herod's moral weakness, not necessarily the fact that it was his birthday. Also, like Pharaoh, Herod was not a follower of God. His behavior throughout the Gospels often shows a disregard for righteousness and truth. This context suggests that Herod's actions during his birthday party should not be taken as a reflection of what God approves or disapproves regarding birthday celebrations in general. This passage, combined with the story of Pharaoh, provides the second major example people often consider when evaluating the Bible's view on birthdays. Both involve rulers who made grave decisions on their birthdays, but neither passage offers a direct teaching about whether birthday celebrations themselves are acceptable or not for God's people. When analyzing the biblical record, one observation becomes very clear. Although birthdays are occasionally mentioned, there are no examples of God's faithful servants celebrating their own birthdays. The Bible contains detailed accounts of the lives of many individuals who were faithful to God, including Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, the prophets, Jesus, and the apostles. Yet, in none of these detailed life stories do we find any record of birthday celebrations. This absence leads some Christians to believe that birthdays were not a part of the spiritual life of God's people. For example, the patriarch Abraham is described as a man who followed God faithfully throughout his long life, yet the Bible never mentions him marking his birthday. The same is true for Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt and received God's law, but whose birthdays are never referenced. Even Jesus Christ, whose birth itself is described in great detail in the Gospels, is never shown celebrating his own birthday during his earthly ministry. Some believers argue that if birthday celebrations were important or pleasing to God, they would likely be included among the many religious practices and traditions recorded in Scripture. God gave Israel numerous feasts and holy days such as Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and the Day of Atonement, which were commanded by God and filled with spiritual meaning. The fact that birthdays are not included among these suggests to some that personal birthday celebrations were not part of God's intended worship practices. Others point out that while absence of evidence does not automatically mean disapproval, the lack of positive examples should at least caution believers against assuming that birthday celebrations are naturally aligned with God's will. They argue that Christians should be careful not to automatically adopt cultural traditions that have no support or precedent in Scripture. However, another perspective acknowledges that the Bible's silence on the matter might simply mean that birthday celebrations were a cultural or personal matter, neither required nor forbidden by God. In this view, since there is no commandment addressing birthdays directly, believers must examine the underlying principles of Scripture to determine whether or not their participation in such celebrations honors God. The lack of positive examples is a significant point of discussion, but it does not settle the question by itself. Therefore, Christians often continue their study by examining additional biblical principles and passages to gain a fuller understanding. Enjoying the video so far? Make sure to leave the like button so that way I know you want to see more like this. While the Bible does not give direct commands about birthday celebrations, it does speak frequently about recognizing and giving thanks for God's blessings. Life itself is repeatedly described in Scripture as a gift from God. This idea is clearly stated in James 1 verse 17, which says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." This verse emphasizes that every good thing people enjoy, including life, health, and the passing of years, ultimately comes from God. For many Christians, this principle forms the foundation for viewing birthday celebrations as an opportunity to give thanks to God for the gift of life and His continuing provision. The Bible encourages gratitude and joyful acknowledgement of God's goodness. In Psalm 118 verse 24 it says, "This is the day which the Lord hath made, we will rejoice and be glad in it." Although this verse does not speak specifically about birthdays, it reflects the general attitude of rejoicing in the days God gives. From this perspective, recognizing a birthday can be seen as a way to honor God by acknowledging another year of life that He has allowed. Some Christians see birthdays as an occasion to gather with family and friends, not merely to focus on the individual, but to collectively thank God for His mercy, protection, and guidance over the past year. They emphasize that if the celebration is centered on gratitude toward God, rather than self-centered pride or vanity, it can be consistent with biblical principles. However, others caution that while life is indeed a gift, the way people celebrate birthdays can sometimes shift focus away from God. They warn that birthday celebrations may lead to excessive self-exaltation, materialism, or pride, especially if the focus becomes receiving gifts, being the center of attention, or seeking praise from others. In Proverbs 16 verse 18 the Bible warns, "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall." Therefore, while celebrating life as a gift from God is a good principle, Christians are encouraged to guard their hearts and ensure that such celebrations remain humble, God-centered, and spiritually healthy. The principle of giving thanks for God's blessings supports the idea that birthday celebrations can be positive when handled with the right attitude. However, the discussion does not end here, as other factors also need to be considered. In the Old Testament, God established several annual feasts and festivals for the nation of Israel. These occasions were set apart to remember God's mighty works, celebrate His provision, and draw the people closer to Him. Examples include Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, among others, Leviticus 23. These feasts involved communal gatherings, sacrifices, joyful worship, and often feasting. They were commanded by God and had specific spiritual meanings tied to the history and relationship between God and His people. The celebrations were not focused on individuals but rather on God's actions and promises. The existence of these biblical feasts shows that celebrating significant events is not inherently wrong in God's eyes. On the contrary, God Himself instituted celebrations with clear purposes: to remember, to thank, and to worship. From this perspective, some Christians argue that birthday celebrations can be viewed similarly, as long as they honor God's role in granting life and do not become occasions of selfishness or excess. They believe birthdays can be moments to reflect on God's faithfulness and grace. However, the key difference is that biblical feasts were divinely commanded and carried specific religious significance. Birthdays, on the other hand, are personal and cultural traditions without direct biblical mandate. Because of this, Christians should carefully evaluate the purpose and manner of birthday celebrations. They should ensure that such events do not contradict biblical teachings or distract from the worship of God. Overall, the example of biblical feasts confirms that celebrations themselves are not condemned by Scripture, but their content, focus, and spirit are what truly matter. Some Christians express concern about the origins of birthday celebrations, questioning whether they have pagan or superstitious roots. Throughout history, certain birthday customs have been linked to ancient beliefs and practices, including astrology, magic, and idol worship. For example, lighting candles on cakes, making wishes, or using astrology to predict a person's future were common in some cultures long before Christianity. These practices can resemble the very things the Bible warns against. In Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12, God commands his people, "There shall not be found among you anyone that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord." These verses explicitly prohibit engaging in occult or pagan practices. This raises a valid concern for believers. If birthday customs include elements connected to forbidden spiritual practices, they may be inappropriate for Christians. However, it is important to differentiate between cultural customs and their original meanings. Many traditions evolve over time, losing their original pagan significance. For example, lighting candles on a cake today may simply be a fun tradition rather than a form of magic. Therefore, Christians are encouraged to examine their birthday celebrations carefully. If any part of the celebration involves practices that contradict biblical teachings or that invoke pagan or occult beliefs, those parts should be avoided. The decision to celebrate birthdays should be made with wisdom and discernment, ensuring that nothing done dishonors God or violates his commands. The New Testament offers important guidance for believers when facing questions about practices not explicitly commanded or forbidden in the Bible. One key passage is found in Romans 14 verses 5 to 6, where the Apostle Paul writes, "One person considers one day more sacred than another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord." In this passage, Paul addresses disputes among Christians regarding the observance of special days. Some believers honored certain days with more significance while others did not. Paul emphasizes that in such matters, personal conviction and sincere faith are what matter most. Applying this teaching to the question of birthday celebrations, it suggests that since the Bible does not specifically command or forbid them, Christians may have freedom to decide for themselves. What is important is that the decision is made thoughtfully, prayerfully, and with a heart seeking to honor God. Paul's instruction encourages believers to avoid judging one another over practices that fall into this category. Instead, each person should respect others' consciences and act according to their own understanding and relationship with God. This principle allows for diversity in how Christians approach birthdays. Some may choose to celebrate with joy and gratitude, while others may decide to abstain for personal or spiritual reasons. Both choices can be acceptable if made with faithfulness and respect. In summary, Paul's teaching provides a framework for handling biblical silence on issues like birthdays by focusing on individual conscience and devotion to the Lord. After carefully examining the biblical references and principles related to birthday celebrations, it becomes clear that the Bible neither directly accepts nor condemns the practice of celebrating birthdays. The few mentions of birthdays that appear in Scripture are found in specific historical contexts that do not provide a direct moral judgment about the act of celebrating birthdays itself. For example, the birthday feasts of Pharaoh in Genesis and Herod in the Gospel of Matthew are simply recorded as events in the narrative, with the focus placed more on the actions and consequences surrounding those events rather than on the celebration of the birthday. Moreover, it is significant to note that the Bible does not include any positive examples of God's faithful people celebrating their birthdays. Important figures such as Abraham, Moses, David, and even Jesus Christ himself do not have recorded birthday celebrations. Neither are birthdays listed among the commanded feasts or religious observances given to the people of Israel. This absence has caused some Christians to question whether birthday celebrations align with biblical faithfulness and worship. On the other hand, the Bible consistently encourages believers to live with an attitude of gratitude, recognizing life as a precious gift from God. Verses such as James 1 verse 17 remind us that every good and perfect gift comes from God. This principle can support the view that birthdays might be a fitting occasion to give thanks for another year of life and God's sustaining grace. However, the Bible also warns against pride, vanity, and self-centeredness. Believers are called to guard their hearts so that celebrations do not become occasions for selfishness or excessive focus on self, which can lead away from true worship. In addition, some Christians express concerns about certain birthday customs and traditions that may have origins in pagan or superstitious practices. The Bible clearly forbids involvement in occult or idolatrous activities, as stated in Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12. Therefore, it is important to avoid any aspects of birthday celebrations that might conflict with biblical teachings or that have questionable spiritual roots. The example of biblical feasts shows that God does approve of celebrations when they have a proper focus, honoring Him and remembering His works. The Old Testament feasts were commanded by God and held deep spiritual significance. While birthday celebrations are personal and cultural rather than divinely mandated, Christians are encouraged to align any celebrations with biblical values and to avoid practices that contradict Scripture. Finally, the Apostle Paul's teaching in Romans 14 verses 5 to 6 offers important guidance for Christians on this issue. He explains that in matters where the Bible is silent or neutral, believers have freedom to follow their own convictions as long as they do so sincerely and in a way that honors the Lord. Paul also emphasizes the need for respect and understanding among believers who may differ in their personal practices. Because of this, birthday celebrations become a matter of personal conscience, motivation, and the attitude of the heart. When celebrated with a humble and thankful spirit, focusing on God's goodness rather than self-glory, birthdays do not contradict biblical teachings. On the other hand, if celebrations foster pride, vanity, or involve questionable customs, it would be wise for believers to reconsider or avoid such practices. In conclusion, the Bible does not explicitly accept or condemn birthday celebrations. Instead, it provides principles for believers to make wise, thoughtful, and God-honoring decisions. Each Christian should carefully examine their motives, the nature of the celebration, and ensure that their actions reflect respect for God and love for others. Do you enjoy celebrating birthdays or do you dislike the tradition? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.